Welcome, ladies. We've heard a lot of topics today about financial inclusion, barriers, opportunities that have spanned technology, regulatory matters. Well, at least you didn't break anything. So we've heard about technology, regulatory matters, operational challenges, but we've touched on gender, but today what we want to do is go a little deeper on that. So I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves first and tell me why gender and financial inclusion is important to them, and then we'll get into more specific questions. So Sabine, do you want to start?
Sure. Perfect. My name is Sabine Mensah. Deputy CEO at Africa Nenda.
I think the other one is.
Okay. Try. Hello? Oh, much better. Hi, my name is Sabine Mensah. I'm Deputy CEO at Africa Nenda. And why financial inclusion is important to me? Because I've seen it. As I grew up, I am a native of Burkina Faso, and I've spent the first 15 years of my life in Burkina Faso. And my best friend as of today, I've seen how access to finance has enabled me to have higher education and more opportunities than she has, and she's one of the smartest person I know in my life. So the differences make in what finance enable in terms of equality of opportunity, access to education, access to health, access to food on your table is definitely the reason why I am a believer in the work we need to do to ensure financial inclusion of women and equality of opportunities as we grow through the world.
Great, thank you. Lillian?
Yeah, no, that one's not working. And I'll build on that. So hi, Lillian Tan. I'm with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I work on the Inclusive Financial Systems team, and I focus on women's financial inclusion, which is a shared goal amongst our team. So I have several colleagues in the room here today who I all expect, if you interact with them, that they will also ask you the same question of how is your work addressing the needs of women. So in terms of why women's financial inclusion is important, at the foundation, we see financial inclusion as an enabler to women's economic power. So the idea that having a secure, safe place to store and access and transact is really an important starting point to women beginning to climb up that financial inclusion journey, to save, to have access to credit, to have growth and income generating opportunities, to build financial resilience for themselves and their household. So really that journey to economic power, and that's really the focus of why we focus on financial inclusion.
Right, and Lillian, to expand on that, why are women so vulnerable with respect to financial inclusion, and what examples you have of where the systems are lacking for women?
Yeah, definitely. And I know we've just got a couple of minutes, but I'm sure we could spend all day on this. And I'm fortunate also that the very first panel this morning started us on that conversation, and Sabine as well. In terms of really the numerous wide range of barriers that women face and in terms of increasing their access and usage to quality digital financial services. So in terms of why women are more vulnerable, again, the reasons are very numerous. Sabine mentioned some of them this morning in terms of women having on average lower access to ID and phone ownership. Numerous other barriers, including that women on average have lower levels of digital and financial literacy, that they have lower levels of fixed asset ownership. So if you think about collateral requirements and having access to credit, to formal credit, social norms are a significant barrier that affect women no matter where you live, in terms of time spent on different household duties and responsibilities, the ability to travel and interact with agents, for example. So again, the barriers are very numerous, but I'll perhaps focus on three additional points that I think are important to mention. And one is that when we talk about women's financial inclusion, that's a very important discussion. but also women are not the same. So also thinking about what segments of women you are targeting when you're thinking about use cases or solutions for them, because the needs of a woman entrepreneur here in Nairobi who may be more educated, may have access to more digital connectivity and networks is very different from a rural entrepreneur who might have lower levels of education, digital financial literacy, et cetera. So really, first of all, when we talk about women, which women are you talking about? So that's point number one. Point number two is I wanted to provide kind of the historical and systemic context, which I think is important for those in this room to think about as you're approaching your work. But I mean, simply put, the financial and banking system as originally designed was not designed with women in mind. So thinking about, well, apologies for the US example, but in the United States, it wasn't until 1974 that women were able to open a bank account in their name. And throughout the 70s and 80s, you saw other countries passing similar equal access laws. And still today, there are 5 countries in the world where women cannot open a bank account in the same way as a man. So meaning they usually require a male family member or a spouse's signature. So I bring that to mind because that systemic historical context is important to remember, that when the financial system was designed, women were not considered viable financial and economic actors. They weren't seen for their income generating potential, and they weren't seen as viable financial customers. And so even though a lot of that, that was a few decades ago, and a lot has been done to course correct, that bias is still there when we think about financial service providers that may or may not collect gender disaggregated data, who may, and if they do, they may not fully understand how to use and analyze that data. They might not view women as that viable customer, as I mentioned. So really wanted to mention that as point number 2 in terms of why women are more vulnerable, because they're not designed with the system in mind. So really encourage all of you when you're going back to your day-to-day work to keep that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about the original rules and rails that the system was built upon. And finally, the third point in terms of vulnerability is just on a global scale, women have lower levels of income levels than men do. So thinking about that vulnerability, a transaction fee represents a significant share of her income compared on average to that of a man. She might be more risk averse, certainly more exposed to consumer protection and fraud. So really thinking about the entire complex compilation of barriers that make women more vulnerable.
Well, you have the floor next, so Sabina, please.
Hello? Is it working? Okay, wonderful. I couldn't say more than what you're saying, Lena. I just wanted to bring statistics to support what you're saying. So first one, in terms of access, I think GSMA says that 69% of women in sub-Saharan Africa have access to a phone versus 82% for a man. From a usage perspective, if you take only the internet, 29% of women have access to the internet versus 49% for male counterparts. And the 5 countries where women cannot open a bank account without the authorization, married women, without the authorization of their husband, Cameroon, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, and Niger, all 5 in Africa. 7 countries, actually, women cannot work without the authorization, married women cannot work without the authorization of their husband. So talking about social norm and the weight they have on equal opportunities from a financial access perspective. So just wanted to add those points.
No, thank you for that. But I also want to ask you a follow-up question, because I know you recently updated the SIPS report. And for those of you, again, I'll make a plug. The Africanenda team has updated the state of inclusive instant payments. It's on their website, and I encourage you to read it if you haven't. But it came up with some additional barriers, particularly for women, small business women. Can you talk a little bit more about those barriers?
It's I think these barriers, if you look at them, they come also a lot with regards to access. When you look at MSMEs, particularly women MSMEs versus male MSMEs and their access to lending, there's a big gap there. And interestingly enough, this was in another life when I worked with financial institution. Some of the institutions were asking women MSMEs more collateral than men MSMEs because women businesses were felt more risky or riskier than male businesses. And when we look at the studies that we did in countries, because a part of the CIPS report includes also a market research, consumer research, we found that in terms of transactions, that male MSMEs actually had on average more transactions than women MSMEs when we're looking at the transaction. But I think when you even get out of that, where we saw in terms of the different barriers touch not only the social norms that we've discussed, but also how suppliers, financial service providers are providing services to women and the type of services. It also touches how regulators are looking at how do we help, bridge that gap. And for that, I would like to give some of the recommendations that the report has taken. Imagine a world where all the central banks were asking the financial service providers to report their customer statistic by gender, mandating it systematically. This will enable us to actually see how big that gap is and on which product that gap is. I think Egypt is actually doing something very interesting where they've put out, Morocco, I'm sorry, mixing. Morocco put out a database where they've looked at MSME lending per women versus male MSMEs, and they actually put these statistics publicly to the financial ecosystem. So that enables more analytics and hopefully help also the financial service provide more services that may be tailored to the women MSMEs. But that's just an example of what we could do. Make the data available, because a lot of countries don't do sex disaggregated data collection and publication in the statistics that we're seeing. So that's one area that is lacking. And if it is for the financial service providers, let's make sure that the services are adapted to the needs of the women. My colleague here, when we were talking, I think it was the gentleman from the Association of Zambia, mentioned the SACCOs, the microfinance institutions, and how we need to make sure that services such as tontine, they call it in West Africa where I come from, chamas in Kenya, where women are gathering together and collecting their money. There's such an opportunity to provide services that can bring these type of savings into the formal ecosystem and enable lending to these groups of women that are really relying on each other and solidarity to be able to do more. Imagine how we can extend credit to the millions of women that are in this type of ecosystem. Sorry. If you let me, I will go on and on. So.
That's fine, but I'm going to give Lillian a chance here too.
Sure.
Lillian, as we all know, the Gates Foundation has been very invested in financial inclusion for some years now. How do you believe that having inclusive instant payment systems changes the direction and future of women in society?
So I touched upon a little bit of this earlier, but in terms of that enabler, financial inclusion, instant payment systems for what? And I think that for what is important to keep in mind. So thinking again about having a safe, an account first, a safe place to store money in a mobile wallet or a bank account, being able to transact. My colleague Costa provided a great example and a great starting point to that conversation already of all of the different use cases and transaction needs that a woman might have, and the need for it to be instant, because again, I mentioned, women on average tend to be more risk averse, have more consumer protection fears and issues that they face. So the need for it to be instant, so that they know that transaction has occurred in a secure way. The need for it to be interoperable, because she might, have different transaction needs across different providers. For her to be able to transact. So really, again, that enabler to save money, to access secure credit, to be able to pay for goods in different ways. So really, as that enabling point to eventually grow income and build resilience and have privacy and control over her financial resources.
So if you look at the folks in this room here today, we've got a really good cross section of the ecosystem. We've got infrastructure players, policymakers, developers, technologists, so a very robust representation of the ecosystem. What is their role in addressing women's financial inclusion?
If I take the infrastructure, the IPS operators that are here, I would say we mentioned it as part of inclusivity, interoperability. If I don't have to have several means of transacting, if any means that I have, the most basic phone that I have, and regardless of whom I'm doing business with, I can do a transaction, it lessens the burden on women, particularly, to be able to interact with the ecosystem. I think you talked about the vulnerability in terms of risk and fraud. When we did our CIPS research, I think in Cameroon and Senegal, the risk of fraud was brought up as one of the reasons why they might not be willing to interact with the digital ecosystem. Making sure that these IIPS, the Inclusive Instant Payment System, have a clear, transparent and efficient recourse mechanism for consumer, and that this is communicated to consumer effectively, is also a way to reassure the trust factor into the ecosystem in terms of consumer and also attracting more women. But I think outside even of the instant payment system, the participants in the instant payment system, the financial service providers, have a key role in leveraging agents as the last mile to have access or provide access to more women to the digital ecosystem, and leveraging women agent is also an opportunity which Christian earlier had mentioned in the case of Rwanda. And if you go even further, I think there's a bigger role for government and regulator to put in incentives to facilitate access to a mobile phone. Countries like Rwanda have done that also with the MNOs, facilitated, low mobile phone for vulnerable population, because that's one of the barriers, having the access, and of course investing also in financial and digital literacy program at the national level. I think those are all areas that can strengthen the capacity of women and facilitate that access that's needed to engage with the digital ecosystem.
Thank you. Go ahead. Can I add to that? Yeah. And just building upon that, I would say for everyone in the room, keeping in mind both, I mentioned earlier that the customer segment, so what type of women, which segments of women are you aiming to reach, and understanding and assessing the specific barriers in that contextual context that they're facing, that you're aiming to address. So always keeping that front of mind. In terms of the policymakers, technologists, infrastructure designers in the room, ensuring that you do have the voice of the end customer in the room with you in your working groups, in your committees. Do you not only have a woman represented, but somebody who is working with women customers who understands that customer group? Are they included in the room and providing that perspective? And so really keeping that in mind. And then for the regulators in the room, just to build upon some of the consumer protection items that Sabine mentioned, we've done a lot of work with an organization called IPA, who's done a lot of consumer protection research, and they've done consumer surveys in Kenya, Nigeria, and India, for example. And one kind of data point that was really astounding, keeps me up at night, is they found that when men and women experience an issue with a financial service provider, women are more likely to report that they will stop using that service, perhaps revert to cash. So really thinking about the potential to even widen the gender gap if we don't address a lot of the consumer protection issues is something to keep in mind.
So do we have tools in our back pockets? I mean, Africa Nenda is a huge advocate for financial inclusion, as is the Gates Foundation. What tools are we providing to the marketplace to help them think about tackling this problem in new ways?
You know why I'm letting you start, Lillian? Because even, I think it was last year, we are South African and benefited from a workshop you did on a gender lens, and it was really very powerful. So that's why I wanted to give you the honor to share those tools first.
Yeah, and certainly the SIPS report and a lot of the reports that African Nenda produces likewise. So in terms of tools, I'll point to a couple. One that the foundation does have, in terms of just understanding the basic principles of gender equality, we have a website, the Gender Equality Toolbox, which really, if you're wanting foundational knowledge, provides just the basics of why gender equality is important and why gender gaps exist. On a more specific level to the financial sector and instant payment systems, Costa had mentioned earlier our Level 1 project guide, and there is a gender guide component to that, which details out how the Level 1 project principles affect women, along with some case studies, and that was developed in 2020, 2021. And we also have a website that details from an organization called Grid Impact that details out barriers that are most proximate to women. There's about 35 barriers listed that detail out and also provide a lot of great background in terms of how to analyze and understand which barriers are most relevant from your country context. And that's available, and they've also created a guide that, again, connects the barriers to the L1P principles. Although I think they're refreshing it, so it may not be up on the website right now. So those are all great starting points, and we've also partnered with Africanenda, for example, to provide a workshop to talk about how their work affects women and to make that connection as well. And we will be creating more guide and a toolkit to recognize all of the various ecosystem players and how your work does reach that end user.
And if I can add to that, I want to thank Steve earlier. You mentioned chapter 4 in SIP's report, so SIP's 2023. I encourage you to check it out because we're looking at challenges and opportunities in inclusivity of instant payment system, and we have a full chapter on why these systems need to ensure that they include women. What are some of the common barriers that we see and some opportunities also that we are recommending from different stakeholders to contribute to that journey. But if I can leave you with one thing, again, please help me advocate for sex disaggregated data for all the regulators. I mean, if that's just one thing in a year, we could all do that. I mean, that would already help us a lot to understand, because I truly believe that you can only improve what you measure, and knowing that measure for certain would actually help us see even more where we're lacking.
Right. So I'm going to go off script for a moment. Don't panic. There's a lot of executives in the room here today, a lot of men, as far as ratios are concerned. That implies that we still have a leadership gap for women. It could also, not necessarily stating this as fact, but imply that there may not be equal pay for equal work. As businesswomen and leaders in your industries, what are your thoughts on progress being made in leadership and equal pay?
That's a great question, Paula. I think it's even a question people are afraid to put on the table. That's how close it is, at least for me personally. I think there's a need. I think there's a need for us to make sure that we have more women representation here, women that are qualified, and give them the opportunity to be here. I think there's an opportunity for all of us at a leadership position to walk the talk, not just make the talk. Because a lot of time we hear the talk. Yes, we are gender intentional. Yes, we have gender parity, but when you go deeper into the equation, you will see that there are some inequalities. Sometimes with the type of position that's considered female type of position, and sometimes with the pay in the position at equal capacity with a male counterpart, and some other time when not even necessarily being given the opportunity to sit at the table. I love that phrase. It came in, I think, from Costa when we were starting this conversation with Africanenda. Well, 2 years ago, people would have said, Africanenda who? And now they're like, oh yeah, sure, we know them. We have a seat at the table. We need more women to have a seat at the table. I'm really happy that this panel is all three of us, because that enough is a sign that we are professionals in our industry. And I do hope to see more evolution of opportunities for women, whether it is on pay, on opportunity, and on leadership.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. Certainly much progress has been made, but much more progress needs to occur. But also it's not just having a woman in leadership, it's this entire complex set of processes, policies, pay, training, and mentorship and support that needs to come to ensure this continued pipeline of women in leadership. I'll point to maybe 2 reports for anyone who wants to dive deeper and really understand all of the complex issues at play. Women's World Banking, which is a partner of ours, has done a great report looking at Nigeria and women in the banking sector specifically, given that there is a mandate for women on boards and in executive positions within banks for a certain percentage to be women. So really looking at what are the continued problems that women are still facing even with a mandate. And then also the World Bank Africa Gender Innovation Lab, they've done a really interesting study in Ethiopia looking at women in leadership in the financial sector. And again, highlighting a lot of the complex issues at play, that just because you've got a woman in a leadership position doesn't mean you've set her up for success.
So I'm going to give you, Sabine, I'm going to give you the last word. This is your local, this is your neighborhood. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with the Mojaloop community?
Maybe one statistic I found out, and I thought it was interesting. So even in Kenya, most advanced market for digital, there are 88% women have access to a phone versus 93% male. So even in the most advanced market, there are still some disparities. So I think we have an opportunity to look at it, even from the IPS operator, from a just commercial point. It's half of the world is women. I mean, if you had both, you would have more revenue. So I'm hoping that we can really look at the different segments of women. We are not all the same. And for each segment, there are products and services that are relevant. And that would definitely make a difference in the business propositions that are put out there. And of course, the regulators have a role also to make an enabling environment for more women financial inclusion across Africa. So it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you both for joining us this afternoon. We're going to give you 2 minutes back so that you can make your way to lunch. I hope this generated some new interest in all of you in the room to discuss this further. We'll be here all week and happy to expand on this topic. So thanks again and have a great lunch.